Hello, and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Before we begin, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you really want to support our community, you can join my Patreon. We have a very big goal there. I will talk about that at the end of the video. Our story today begins in 2021. A man named Don Miller gets a phone call. Don is a retired Texas cop, and the man calling him is a buddy of his that's still on the force. This buddy tells Don he's just received a very strange phone call. A citizen from Abilene has called the Stephenville Police Department to tell them that he is a person who buys up properties at auctions, and he has just purchased a double-wide trailer. The tenant who had been renting that trailer died a while back, and the owner of the trailer, the landlord, had sold it to this man in Abilene. So the new owner goes inside to clean it out, and he found something that he thought the police should have. The citizen then begins to tell Don that he'd found boxes full of photographs, and some of them were of him, of Don Miller. There were hundreds of handwritten pages about a murder that took place back in 1987. There was even a document that appeared to be some sort of manifesto. As Don Miller listened, he knew immediately what this was all about, and he knew who the tenant of the trailer must have been. He told the new owner of the trailer, "Stay put, I'll be right there." This is a story about murder, but it's also a story about tribalism and groupthink. It's a story about what happens in small-town America when someone doesn't fit the mold, and it's a story about the fact that you can't run away from your problems. It's better to face them head-on. This is the story of the murder of Susan Woods, the Stephenville Murder. I'm your host, Stacy Lee. Let's get into it. July 1987. Susan Woods is living in Stephenville, Texas, where she was born and raised. Susan was a shy woman, very soft-spoken. She was average height, and she had beautiful brown hair that fell past her shoulders. She was 30 years old in 1987 and living alone for the first time in a very long time. Susan Woods was not a happy woman. She had just spent the last few years of her life moving from state to state in hopes of keeping her husband happy. Susan was married to this man, Michael Woods, and Michael had big dreams. He wanted to become a famous rock star. He knew that would never happen living in Stephenville, so he dragged Susan from town to town, and when Michael's dreams didn't pan out and the money ran out, they'd land back in Stephenville. It happened time and again, but the last time it happened, Susan said that was it. Michael gave Susan an ultimatum. It was Stephenville or him, and Susan chose Stephenville. Michael packed up, took the only car the couple owned, and moved back to Indianapolis, where he was from. And Susan found herself devastated and shocked that he'd really left. She got a job at the local sandpaper factory and spent most of the time when she wasn't working sitting in her apartment moping. But then Susan missed work. She missed one shift and then two, and so her supervisor called her father, Joe Atkins, who was also a lifelong resident of Stephenville. After Susan's father, Joe, got the phone call, he jumped in his pickup truck and drove to Susan's tiny little white bungalow that she was renting downtown by the elementary school. As Joe pulled into the driveway, he noticed the house was dark, and the house shouldn't have been dark. He turned off the engine and stepped out of his truck. It was a hot night, and it was quiet. It was too quiet. The only sound in the air was the high-pitched whine of cicadas. Joe walked up the porch, and his heart sunk as he turned the doorknob and found the door unlocked. The door creaked as he opened it, and Joe stepped inside. He called for Susan, but there was no answer. He probably would have been surprised if there had been. He could feel it. He walked through the living room and into the back bedroom, and there, in the bathroom, he found his daughter. She was on her knees in front of the bathtub. She was naked. Her hands had been tied behind her back with a tank top, and her head was sunk down low into a tub full of black water. Joe backed out of the room, and he called the police. Sergeant Donnie Hensley arrived at the house near 9 o'clock. When he pulled up, he saw Joe Atkins standing there, and he asked, "What are you doing here, Joe?" And Joe replied, "Donnie, they killed her." "They killed who, Joe?" he asked. Joe then said, "They killed my daughter." Donnie took Joe's hands and the two men said a prayer. This is deep Bible Belt country and the town is very religious. Donnie told Joe to go home and tell his family what had happened, told him they'd need him now. A few moments later, Susan's best friend, Cindy Hallmark, and her boyfriend, Roy, pulled up at the scene, just by chance. When Cindy was told Susan was dead, her screams pierced the hot night air 2 blocks away. More officers arrived on the scene. Photos were taken, and then the medical examiner gave the okay to remove the body. Later at autopsy, it was found that Susan had been raped and sodomized. There was a deep red line across her throat where the killer had used something to try and strangle her. Susan's bedroom showed obvious signs of a struggle. There was bedding thrown all over the room and the mattress was off center. Officers noticed a white electrical cord on the bed and posited that it had been used to try and strangle Susan. Donnie Hensley would later say that of all the horrific things he saw that night, one image stayed with him the longest: the death mask of Susan's face, created when the killer held a pillow over her face for a long period of time. You could see the indentation of Susan's features on the pillow, the eyes complete with mascara, and the lips complete with lipstick stained on the case. Oh, that is indeed a very graphic and haunting image. Crime scene detectives found 2 good sets of fingerprints, and they also found some palm prints. Fingerprints and palm prints are great if you know who they belong to. If you don't, they don't do you much good. Remember, this was 1987. DNA science was in its infancy, with good analysis and practical use being years away. There wasn't even a national fingerprint database at the time. Officers from the Stephenville Police Department were sent up and down the streets to talk to neighbors. No one had heard a thing. No one had seen a thing. They hadn't heard screams. They hadn't heard a fight. The next morning, a lieutenant named Ken Maltby told all of the police officers in the Stephenville Police Department that he and he alone would be investigating Susan Wood's death. This was not only unusual, it was a bad idea. Donnie Hensley later said that Ken wanted to be a hero. He wanted to solve the case on his own. That just wasn't the way things were usually done. Lieutenant Maltby investigated the murder for months, and he made little progress. There was a suspect, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. But then Ken Maltby was placed in charge of a narcotics unit, and Donnie Hensley took over Susan's case. Officer Hensley was stunned when he learned that Ken Maltby hadn't even left a note on the matter. He hadn't recorded interviews, he hadn't written a handwritten note, he hadn't typed any reports. Donnie Hensley would be starting from scratch. The pressure was on, and everyone in Stephenville wanted to know who killed Susan Woods. October 1987. Donnie Hensley set about interviewing Susan's family and her friends. The body had been badly decomposed, so it was difficult for the coroner to determine whether Susan had been smothered, strangled, or drowned. There was no sign of forced entry in Susan's apartment, but there was something strange. On the living room table, there was an ashtray with 6 cigarette butts in it. Susan was not a heavy smoker. She might smoke a cigarette here and there while having a cocktail, but she didn't smoke at home. And there was also a can of Coke on the table, and everyone knew Susan did not drink soda. She was very conscious of her weight, and she only drank water with her meals. She would never drink a full sugar soda. So to the police that learned this information about Susan, it meant that somebody else had been in the house, sitting with Susan, spending time with her. Or did they stay after she was dead? Susan worked 6 days a week. She was trying to save money to replace the car her husband Michael had taken. Sunday was her only day off, and she spent that day doing laundry and going grocery shopping. Now, later on it would come out that Susan did have a few encounters with a bartender near Granbury. This bartender's name was J.C. Bachman, and so the police spoke with J.C. J.C. took a polygraph, and he passed. You know, that doesn't mean much to me, but his big break was that his fingerprints and palm prints did not match those found in the bathroom. He was off the hook. Then Donnie Hensley looked into Cindy's boyfriend. Remember, Cindy was Susan's best friend. Cindy's boyfriend was a man named Roy Hayes. Well, he's now Cindy's husband. They got married after Susan's death, and they're still together. Roy took a polygraph, and he passed. His fingerprints were in the house because he was there often, but they were not in the blood in the bathroom. Donnie Hensley investigated for months, and by Christmas, he hadn't made much progress. He later told a reporter that a few people in town came right up to his face and said, "You're just plain stupid for wasting your time investigating this." Why? Because you see, everyone in town had already decided they knew exactly who killed Susan Woods. Everyone in town was sure they knew who did it. It was the one guy who stood out like a sore thumb. Now, I'm going to tell you, this story really strikes a chord in me. I had just turned 17 when Susan was killed, and Stephenville might as well have been Cedar City, Utah, where I grew up. Hell, Cedar actually made Stephenville look like a metropolis. Stephenville had about 13,000 people in it. Cedar only had about 10 at that time. If you're not from a little town like this in that era, it's difficult to truly understand what the culture was like. I was teased and bullied relentlessly in middle school because I wore pink high-top Converse. Pink. I dared wear pink shoes. I had girls that literally tried to beat my ass for wearing pink Chucks to school. If you think I'm making this up, talk to someone you know from a small western town in the 1980s, probably the East too. But about 1984, I started wearing Izods with the collars up. I'd wear one of my dad's ties and then one of his oversized cardigan sweaters with the peg leg 501 jeans and penny loafers with no socks. And let me tell you, my life was a living hell. Why? Because everyone else at school, well, almost everyone, I did have a few friends, was in Ropers, Wranglers, and plaid Western button-up shirts, the kind with the Western detail on the yoke and the mother-of-pearl buttons, you know, those kind. While everyone else was in a denim Wrangler jacket, you remember that one with the tan corduroy collar? I was in an oversized trench coat. They wore cowboy boots, I wore boat shoes. The only thing that kept me from getting a daily physical beating was the fact that my grandpa was the math teacher, the basketball referee, and he ran the school store. He was there all day in school and he kept an eye on me. That didn't stop me from getting bullied, but it did stop me from getting jumped. So when I tell you I know what it feels like to be the one who doesn't fit in, I know what it feels like to be the one who doesn't fit in. I'm 53 years old and I'm still the one who doesn't fit in. And when you don't fit in, you get the negative attention, you get the teasing, and you often get the blame. And Stephenville, Texas was more than happy to place the blame for Susan's murder on the one who didn't fit in. In Stephenville, Texas, just like in my hometown of Cedar City, Utah, you had a very few set looks. If you were a motorhead, you were in a band t-shirt and 501s with Vans or sneakers. If you were a Scholastic kid, you were in a sweater and chinos. If you were a jock, you were in jeans, a t-shirt, and your Letterman's jacket. And if you were a cowboy, you were in Wranglers, an FFA jacket, and a Western shirt. Same for Stephenville. In Stephenville, Texas, in the 1980s, everyone had short haircuts, cleanly shaven faces, and they all drove a pickup truck. Well, everyone but one man, Susan Woods' ex-husband, Michael, the aspiring rock star. Michael Woods wore a leather jacket and motorcycle boots. He had a beard, he had long hair, and he had a very bad attitude. He didn't drive a pickup truck, he drove a motorcycle. It was rumored that he sold weed, although Michael denies that he couldn't hold a job, and that he had a bad temper. Susan was always the one that had a job, working to support Michael. Cindy, Susan's friend, said Michael was a bum. Michael lifted weights in the front yard of their house. He liked looking muscular and walking around with his shirt off. He wasn't from Stephenville, and everyone knew that. Michael was also pretty much the only person that didn't participate in the only things to do in Stephenville: football, rodeo, and church. Michael had moved around a lot as a kid, and he was a music fanatic. He loved Lynyrd Skynyrd, and he loved fashioning his look after the musicians of that era. Michael had had a very rough home life, and he'd often lived on his friends' couches, playing music on street corners to earn enough money to get by. He moved to Stephenville with a friend, and there he caught Susan's eye. They were polar opposites. They couldn't have been more different. Michael was the bad boy, the outcast, and Susan was the hometown girl, sweet and innocent, timid and naive. Susan hadn't dated at all in high school, but she fell hard for Michael. She told her friends that she liked him because he looked like Bob Seger. Her friends didn't agree. Michael met Susan's parents. They hated him. Like I said, he walked around the yard and around the house in the little cut-off shorts of the day and nothing else. And Susan's ultra-religious parents found him vulgar. At one point, Joe Atkins told Michael that if he ever hurt Susan, he'd kill him. And so it was not a happy family situation. Michael knew that Susan's parents hated the fact that they lived together, so he proposed and he married Susan. He talked her into moving to El Paso with him. Susan would write letters to Cindy telling her that they were practically starving to death and Michael didn't work. People, no matter where Michael went, had a hard time getting along with him. He did have a very bad attitude. Susan once told Cindy that a neighbor accused Michael of putting sugar in their gas tank after they'd had some sort of a spat. He got fired over and over, and it wasn't unusual for him to get into a physical fight. Susan and Michael moved near Dallas. Then they bounced around from town to town for a while. And then finally, after they'd had enough and the money had run out and Michael hadn't become famous, they ended up back in Stephenville, and that's where they split. Susan was done following Michael around and she wanted to stay home. So Michael went to Indianapolis for a few months, and then he and Susan decided to give it one last shot. He returned to Stephenville in February of 1987, and within about a week, it was worse than ever. After a while, he left for good, but before he did, Michael did something that I find to be incredibly vile and very scary. Michael sat down and recorded a 30-minute cassette tape saying the most disgusting, hateful, and ugly things to and about Susan that you can say about a person. He called her every name in the book. He said terrible things about her parents, about Cindy and Roy. He talked about how much he hated Susan, what a bitch she had always been. He called her things and said things to her that are just foul, vile. I really get the image of Susan that she was not a person that had great self-esteem to begin with, and this must have been so damaging for her. Cindy and Roy listened to the entire tape and said it was just almost too hard to hear. Very, very painful for Susan. The other thing that Michael did, this is just really disturbing. He took a small notepad, and on each page of the notepad, he wrote something horrible. And then he took over 50 pieces of these papers that he'd written awful things on, just the C word or, calling Susan a bitch, something about her parents, and he placed the notes all over the house. When Susan thought she had found them all, she'd open a medicine cabinet and find one of the notes there. She'd lift up a pillow on the couch and find a note there. He went to work making sure that these notes were places where she would have to find them for weeks. That is next level despicable behavior. And Michael, sorry, it is. Susan's parents were furious that Michael would take it this far, and Cindy and her mother begged Susan to move into Cindy's parents' spare room. Cindy was worried that Susan was in danger, but Susan wouldn't hear of it. So Roy went over to Susan's house and nailed all of the windows shut, and he also gave Susan a pistol to keep in the house with her. Cindy, her parents, Roy, Susan's parents were all terrified that something terrible was going to happen to Susan. And something terrible did. Before Susan was murdered, she had finally begun to experience some happiness. This tale is so tragic to me. I see Susan as someone who was really turning a corner, and just when she did, her life was taken from her. The divorce went through, Susan bought a new car, and then she began kind of quietly seeing J.C. Bachman. There is a great podcast on this story. It's called simply Stephenville. And if you're looking for something good for a podcast, I recommend it. I got a lot of information from that podcast. And on the podcast, you get to hear Cindy and Roy and Donnie Hensley talking about this story. And at one point, Cindy tells this story about how Susan was really depressed. And so Cindy and Roy took her to Dairy Queen, and Roy got them all hot fudge sundaes. Cindy was shocked when Susan actually ate her hot fudge sundae. Susan was so calorie conscious that she'd never had ice cream or things like that before. And Cindy was so happy to see her really enjoying herself. And when Susan was finished with her ice cream, she looked up and she said, "You know what? I think I'm going to have another one." And I thought that was such a cute story, and one that shows that Susan was really starting to love herself. She was finally starting to have some joy in her life. And just when that happened, she was dead, you know? I think that's so sad. And I think one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with true crime is just the injustice of someone taking from someone else everything they have to look forward to in the future. That's just, yeah. Cindy was turning her life around and she was murdered. And now it was up to Donnie Hensley to find out who'd killed her. Michael Woods was standing outside his brother's rundown house one day. Michael and his brother bought the house for next to nothing, and they spent all of their free time remodeling it. They were going to turn it into apartments and rent them out for income. But one day in the fall of 1987, 2 police officers pulled up outside the house and walked up to Michael. Now, this was before Donnie Hensley took over the case, so the cops must have been Ken Maltby and somebody else. These 2 cops walk up to Michael and they start asking him questions that didn't make any sense to him. They're talking about the house in Stephenville and the bathtub, and finally one of the cops just says to Michael, "We know you're lying. We know you killed her. Susan's dead, and we know you did it." Michael claims when he heard Susan was dead, he ran to the bathroom and threw up. And the police followed him inside the house. And they said, "Just admit what you did and we'll try and get you into a mental hospital instead of prison." Michael claims he was horrified. He told the police over and over that he had nothing to do with Susan's murder. Michael then claims that Ken Maltby pulled out a gun and said, "Get in the car, we're going to the airport right now." Michael tells the story that he lifted his shirt to show Maltby that he too was carrying a gun. And he claims he said to the cop, "I guess we're going to have a gun battle right here now because I am not going to the airport with you." Now, whether or not that happened, who knows? But the cops did get back in their car, drove back to the airport without Michael, and they left. After that confrontation, almost a year passed, and now the case is in Donnie Hensley's hands. So Donnie decided that he's going to head to Indianapolis to conduct surveillance on Michael Woods. So Donnie Hensley gets a warrant in Texas. He flies to Indianapolis, and that warrant allows him to collect most of Michael's possessions. He was looking for Michael's fingerprints, prints that would match those found in the bathroom on the night of Susan's murder. Michael claims that the police harassed his brother and his sister, and they found a marijuana roach in his sister's purse. So Michael, his brother, and his sister all got hauled to jail. The charges were later dropped, but Michael uses this as an example to talk about the harassment he was experiencing. Officer Hensley was doing his job, investigating the murder. Michael Woods saw it all as a campaign of terror against him and his family. Donnie Hensley took the items that he collected at Michael's house to the lab, and plenty of fingerprints were taken from the objects. Michael had glass figurines, cassette tapes, all things that produce good fingerprints, I guess. Officer Hensley said at that point he could feel the noose tightening around Michael Woods' neck. He began working on an extradition request to have Michael brought back to Texas from Indiana. That's how confident he was they were going to get a match. But then he got the news. The fingerprints taken from Michael Woods' possessions did not match the fingerprints in Susan's bathroom. Not a single print of Michael's was even remotely similar to the prints found in the bathroom on the night of Susan's murder. The case was dead in the water. They had no other suspects. Officer Hensley eventually left the police force to work at the United Nations, and the case went stone cold. The really sad thing is no one bothered to tell Michael Woods that he had all but been eliminated. And so Michael continued to live his life as though it could all come to an end on any given day. He knew he hadn't killed Susan, but he didn't know that the police knew that. And just when the cops eased off, Susan's family came for Michael. 1989. 2 years after Susan's murder, her parents filed a lawsuit against Michael Woods. Susan had a life insurance policy, and she listed Michael Woods as the beneficiary. The policy was for about $11,000, and in this civil lawsuit, Susan's family claimed Michael was not entitled to the payout because he was her murderer. Michael refused to attend the trial that this civil case brought about, and his absence resulted in him not only losing the case, but for some unknown reason, the judge also hitting him with an outrageous $700,000 judgment. So basically, Susan's parents, along with most of Stephenville, including Cindy and Roy, and apparently the judge, still firmly believed that Michael Woods was the killer, and they were going to punish him one way or the other. Michael sought legal advice, and he was told that as long as he stayed out of the state of Texas, they could not collect the judgment against him. Well, that was no problem for Michael Woods. He had no intention of ever returning to the Lone Star State. Michael sank into a deep depression. He was afraid that if he traveled outside of Indiana, even if he avoided Texas, there was a risk that he would be arrested and extradited. So he quit traveling, and that meant quitting music. He took on different jobs, but never really liked any of them. He was taking antidepressants, and he was drinking heavily. Then the Indianapolis paper ran an article about Susan's murder, and people started coming up to Michael while he was on stage playing, asking, "Hey, are you the guy that killed your wife?" Oh, so many things about this story remind me of my life. I have a very, very big part of my life that I have never even begun to address here because I don't have full permission to discuss that part of my life, and I don't want people that I care about to be upset with me. But one day I'm really hoping to tell you this story. It is a story that many people know, but it is not a story that I'm going to talk about here yet. But let's just say I know what it feels like to be at work, standing in my restaurant that had an open kitchen, and have people walking up and saying things that were very upsetting to me. I know what that feels like, so I can imagine what that felt like for Michael. You get to a point where you don't want to leave your house. You don't want to be in public, let alone perform in public. My therapist says I still have doorbell PTSD from the press and people ringing my doorbell and stuff. It traumatizes you, and it makes you feel like a trapped rat. Michael was convinced he was going to be arrested any day. And if I'm going to be honest, I think it's kind of shitty that the cops didn't tell Michael his fingerprints didn't match. But then again, Michael could have called and asked, you know. He had some onus on him to stay up on this, and he just didn't want to deal with it. And I understand that, but that's not how you get closure. Well, it all came to a head for Michael in 2005. He was playing a birthday party with his brother when he got finished and kind of had a mental breakdown, and he started to cry kind of out of nowhere. And a friend of his named Barbara Gary saw Michael off in the corner crying, and she wanted to know why. And this was when Michael told his story. She said he'd finally decided to ask for help. This is why we ask for help, my friends. This is why we need each other. When we can't take something anymore, there is almost always someone who will pick up our burden and carry it for us, or at least help us. This is why we don't give up, and this is why we don't make rash decisions that can't be undone when we're low, because things do get better. Things can always get better. Michael asked for help, and he got it. Barbara sent an email to the Stephenville police, and by this time, the case had been passed to this officer, Don Miller. Don didn't really know what to say to Barbara. There simply was not any new information. Don had even gone so far as to have the 6 cigarette butts found in the ashtray at Susan's house tested for DNA as that technology evolved, but it just came back as unknown male DNA. Don told Barbara that if Michael really wanted to clear this up, he needed to get his DNA. Now, Michael was very hesitant. 5 months passed between Barbara's first phone call and Don visiting Michael. Don decides to fly to Indianapolis and try to get the DNA himself. Don goes to Michael's front door, and Michael opens the front door and says, "I already told you, I'm not going to cooperate." And Don Miller just started tap dancing, pleading his case. And he finally convinced Michael that having his DNA tested against the cigarette butts was the only way he would ever clear his name, and Michael agreed to a swab. Don flew back to Texas and turned Michael Wood's DNA sample in for testing against the cigarette butts. He waited anxiously to find out whether the entire town of Stephenville was right about the killer, about whether the people closest to Susan were right about Michael. Well, the results came back. Everyone was wrong. Michael Wood's DNA did not match the DNA taken from the cigarette butts. His fingerprints did not match the prints in the bathroom. Don Miller called Michael and said, "Michael, you are 100% cleared from this case. Your fingerprints don't match. The DNA doesn't match. You are no longer a suspect." Michael Woods began to cry. He then quietly said thank you, and he hung up the phone. After almost 20 years, he was finally free. But now the question was, who on earth killed Susan Woods? May 2006. Don Miller gets word that the Texas Department of Public Safety had gained access to the FBI database. Remember, our states have not always had a singular database like CODIS to work from. Having a database that was connected not only between departments but states really changed everything in the world of crime solving. Don Miller did not have high hopes that this new database would help him solve the case, but he thought, what have I got to lose? And so he drove to Austin and handed over the fingerprints lifted in Susan's bathroom 20 years earlier. A few days later, Don got a phone call from an officer trained on the database. And he said, hey, Don, we got a match on those prints. Don could not believe what he had just heard. He said, who'd they come back to? And the officer on the other end of the phone said, Joseph Scott Hatley. Don Miller replied, never heard of him. Officer Miller had absolutely no idea who Joseph Scott Hatley was. The officer in Austin told Don the only thing he had on his record that he could see was that he was arrested in 1988 for a robbery in Nevada and that he's got some sort of a record in Erath County. Don Miller hung up and immediately called the Erath County prosecutor, John Terrell, and asked him, hey, do we know a Joseph Scott Hatley? And the prosecutor was like, oh yeah, he's a local kid. He raped a girl, but the grand jury declined to indict him. I'll get the file for you. This was all happening very quickly, and Don was shocked. A totally unknown suspect with a record of committing crimes similar to those committed against Susan had now come out of the woodwork. Don got a hold of Hatley's file, and he was gobsmacked. After Susan was murdered, Hatley allegedly brutally raped a 16-year-old girl, but the grand jury didn't believe her. Hatley was from a well-known family in Stephenville. His dad had run the local Texaco and then the diesel repair shop. His mother stayed at home and raised their 3 kids. The Hatleys were a well-liked, church-going, God-fearing Texas family, but one of them was a monster. Don continued to read the file and he saw something that made his blood run cold. The girl Hatley had said at one point after she'd been assaulted that she ran down the roadside of the park, this park here where they were at, where her assault took place, and that Hatley chased her. He caught up to her and tackled her, and then she said, he laid on top of me and told me if I didn't mind him, he would kill me, and he said he'd done it before. Don Miller remembers saying out loud, son of a bitch, he did it. Miller tracked Joseph Scott Hatley down. He was already in jail on aggravated assault charges for a separate attack. A grand jury indicted Hatley for Susan's murder and a trial date was set. But a week before the trial was to begin, Hatley confessed. He was sentenced to 30 years and only did 11 of those years. Yeah. He did 11 years for murdering Susan and for basically ruining Michael Wood's life as well. It's very appalling and something very un-Texas-like. Texas is not known for its light sentences, so I'm not sure what happened here. They had fingerprints, they had DNA. Why only 11 years? Hatley got out of prison in August of 2018 when he was 52 years old. Don Miller was angry when he found out Hatley was released. He told the press that the man is a monster and he's a danger. Now, there is a lot of information about Joseph Scott Hatley that is quite interesting. He was a friend of Susan's cousin. That's how he knew Susan. But this was a very strange and troubled man. We don't really have time to go into him today, but again, I'll plug the podcast, Stephenville, where you can hear more about him. I don't have anything to do with the Stephenville podcast, but I always like giving other true crime creators a nod when they do good work, and it's a good one. Helped me a lot covering the story, like I said. Joseph Scott Hatley spent a little time at a halfway house, and then he moved into a trailer park. In the fall of 2021, he told his daughter that he'd had cancer and that it had returned and spread to his spine. 6 weeks later, his landlord found him dead on the floor of his trailer at only 56 years old. Very soon after this, the retired cop received the phone call that we talked about in the beginning of this episode, where the new owner of Joseph Scott Hatley's trailer found his possessions after he had died. Hatley had become obsessed with the police officers hunting him. He took great joy in the fact that he wasn't even on their radar, and he included all of his thoughts in his writings. He called the Stephenville police Barney Fife and the Keystone Cops. Hatley writes that he cannot believe he's never even been interviewed, and he mocks the police for fixating on Michael Woods. He even calls Michael another one of his victims. Like I said, there's a lot more information on Hatley in the podcast. Don Miller is convinced that Hatley has many, many more victims and is most likely a serial rapist and perhaps a serial killer. Joseph Scott Hatley has a daughter named Amanda. She has gone on to tell of the horrors her own mother endured at the hands of Hatley. Amanda was not surprised when her father was arrested for murder. She had seen with her own eyes the brutality that he was capable of. I often wonder what it would feel like to be raised by a monster, and it's something I'm glad I'll never understand. When Amanda was interviewed, she tearfully spoke about the terrible things her father did to her mother, and then she simply said, "I don't know what to tell you. My dad was just a really bad guy." Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more from me, and you can always join my Patreon. In the end, we have a big goal there. We want to raise money to donate to police departments that have cold case DNA in storage. There are thousands of sexual assault kits all around the country that have never been tested. We want to pick a case, our community, pay to get that kit tested, and hopefully solve a crime. In getting the kit tested, we also get that perpetrator's DNA in the system in case they've committed other crimes. I sure appreciate you joining me today and spending some of your day with me. Your support means the world to me. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I will see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.